Hello and welcome back on my channel. Thank you so much for joining me again. Today is day 2 of the Once Upon a Book Club Advent Calendar unboxing. So get your favorite beverage and get cozy because I'll be reading a short story to you. If you're not interested in the short story and you just want to unpack day 2 with me, there's going to be a timestamp in the description box where you can just jump ahead. I think today's short story is going to be a long one, so really, I mean it, get comfortable and get ready to listen. I hope that even though English is not my first language, that my reading is okay and that you're starting to look forward to hear a story from me every single week. Now, if you're wondering why I am reading an advent calendar in January, February, well, it's because it took forever to get to me. So we'll just have fun doing this in January. I will be releasing one day every single week, so this is a weekly recurrence that you can look forward to. And now let's dive into story number 2. After story number 1, I have high expectations because it really touched me. So let's see what story number 2 is like. Ways Without End by T.M. Segal. Among the sunken ruins of an ancient city, its stones still wet from the retreating tide, a stranger walked boldly down broken cobblestone streets. Each turn is short, each step is planned, as if he was already familiar with the route. Soon enough he reaches a crossroad where 3 narrow and twisting alleyways converge. There he pauses and looks around. Little remains of the sunken city after whatever cataclysm sent it beneath the waves. On the northern side of the crossroads there stands a single doorway. The walls and building around it long crumbled to ruin. It was rounded on the top and wide across, and the sides lacked even the shadowy traces of ornamentation. A second doorway, also standing free of its source, could be found on the eastern side. This doorway was tall and narrow, with a pattern of roses and thorns carved bas-relief all around its edges. The weight of the water had softened the design, but it could still be made out clearly. The third corner had no doorway, nor even the barest hint of a wall. All that stood there was a sweeping staircase, climbing up from nowhere to nothing, as the higher steps had been swept away. To the stranger, all 3 structures glowed faintly with softly colored light, and faint lines like threads spread outward into the air around them. The stranger glanced up at the 3 moons, beaming fully down upon him, and quickly judged their distance from the horizon. He had time, barely, to examine each of his options before he committed to one of them. Just as he put his hand on the side of the round doorway and felt the crisp scent of snow wafting toward him, a scream rent the air. Without hesitation, he turned and ran toward the sound, drawing his sword by the time he finished his first step. Quickly he moved away from his goal and back toward the shore. To reveal the city, the tide had retreated to its further extent. A low water mark it reached only once every 10 years. The closest village was several li away, and it was well past the midnight hour. He'd believed that he was entirely alone. Near the leading edges of the city, the few algae-lick stones closest to the shore, he found the source of the scream. Tangled up in a pile of kelp was a little girl, perhaps 11 or 12 winters old. The clammy kelp clung to her, and the more she struggled, the more tangled the kelp became. She had screamed when the slimy stuff first touched her skin, but now she fought to get free. "Well now," the stranger said as he took in her plight, "what are you doing here?" "Ghost!" the little girl screamed and looked away from the kelp to find what terrifying phantom had come to kill her. It was not a ghost, but a person holding a naked sword in his left hand. clearly illuminated by light of the 3 full moons. Like the city, he was rough and ancient looking, with deep lines etched into his face and hands like gnarled wood. He wore dark denim pants and a cotton shirt with a large and heavy fur and leather jacket that added to his bulk. Both his boots and the sword looked well made and well worn with use. In addition, he wore several smaller daggers, and over his shoulder was slung a round tube carrying case, like that used for maps. And on his head, looking neat and nearly new, was a soft-colored knit hat with a round tassel topper bobbing around in the wind. The little girl opened her mouth, blinked twice, and then closed her mouth. "Grandfather?" she ventured, using the respectful form of address for an elder. He crouched down and began pulling at the seaweed. "I'm Martin," he said, a soft accent giving a strange lilt to his words. "I'm Amali." Her initial attempts to escape had knotted the strands around her, and she was properly entangled. Although his hands were spotted and withered with age, his grip was firm and sure as he tore at the kelp. It took him several long minutes to remove enough of the seaweed for her to stand up and shake off the rest. By the time he'd finished, the sea's foamy water was lapping at their feet. Between them and the safety of the shore stood the broken streets and tumbled down buildings of the ancient city, a maze of boulders and sudden drops. "Amali, listen," Martin said as he scanned the land and familiarized himself with his parts of the ruins. "I need you to start running for the shore, and don't stop until I tell you to." She could have asked why, but she didn't need to. Looking down at the ground, she could see silt swirling in the water that now covered the tips of her shoes. "That way. Go," Martin said, pointing, not toward the closest part of the shore, but several degrees to the right of it. They had little time left, but sometimes he knew the fastest route was a detour. Only after she began to run did he follow suit, and he always stayed behind her. Occasionally he shouted direction such as "jump" or "turn left," and Amali would follow it. His directions were always timely and clear, and they helped Amali overcome the small obstacles in her way. He had no such difficulties, jumping over small boulders and loping along behind her with ease. Still, they reached the shore only a few steps ahead of the tide, which was surging up the soft sandy beach. Amali was panting, but she didn't stop until Martin told her she could. Some 15 feet past the high water mark, she collapsed in a heap, panting fiercely. Martin kept on, however, quickly gathering half-dried driftwood and reeds from nearby to build a fire. The flames had barely flickered to life before Amali was reaching out for the warmth. She was shivering beneath the steady late-night breeze with ocean mist. Once again, Martin didn't hesitate. He took off his jacket, revealing it to be 2 coats layered over each other. The inner coat of soft leather, which had remained surprisingly dry, he draped over Amali's small shoulders. The outer layer of oil-slicked brown fur he put back on. Only when all of this was done did he finally sit down, first unclipping his sword to rest it on the sand beside him. "All right now," he said. "What were you doing playing in the ruins like that?" "I wasn't playing," Amali protested. "I was on an adventure." "Oh?" "Yeah," she insisted. "I'm looking for the crown of Tithali." He said, and she hunched her shoulders in protection against the disparaging lecture that never came. "Odd. I don't see any digging equipment." Amali once again blinked in surprise and stared at the old man across from her. He took off the knit hat and brushed off sand and dust. He folded it up and put it into a silk bag, which he then rested on his knee. Had he not heard her correctly? Was he being intentionally cryptic? Why were old people like this? "Why would I have digging equipment?" she asked, because she dared not ask any of the other questions of an elder. "Well, it seems to me," Martin explained, "that by now any object as small as a crown would have either been washed away or buried, if not beneath sand, silt, and stone, then beneath coral and kelp. You'll need more than small hands and scrawny arms to dig it out." Her eyes flickered to the left and then the right and finally settled on the ocean waves. She pursed her lips for a moment. I was just, It's fine, Martin said, cutting her off before she could offer a coherent answer. You're still young, and the first few adventures are always a little slapdash. He too looked over at the ocean, where the water had once again buried the ruins, leaving only a few stones between them and the horizon. Next time, you should choose somewhere without such a strict time limit. She snapped her head over, eyes wide, and grabbed at him. Next adventure? That wasn't what he was supposed to say. He was supposed to tell her that she'd been stupid and that she should never do anything so dangerous ever again. Yeah, he said with a thoughtful frown. Unless you've had enough adventures and want nothing more to do with exploring strange and dangerous places? No, not ever. Good, he said with a smile, and he poked at the fire with a sword. She began, then stopped and frowned deeply. He waited, and sure enough, she tried again later. Are you also an adventurer? Something like that, he nodded. It was as good as a name as any for what he did. Then you're looking for the crown of Tithala too, or maybe the treasure house of Iboden? Martin shook his head. No, nothing like that. What I seek is only of concern to myself. But what is it? He chuckled softly. The next step in my journey. Amalie's face scrunched up, her eyebrows coming down, her nose wrinkling and her mouth twisting as she tried to make sense of that comment. Grandfather, she said after a moment, I don't quite get what you mean. No matter, he reassured her. Some things only need to make sense to the person saying them. If Amalie considered cryptic and confusing answers as a sure sign of old age, as white hair and wrinkles, and she did, then this old man was very old indeed. Grandfather Martin, she said as she looked over the pure white hair and deeply lined face of the man across from her. Forgive me for saying so, but aren't you too old for adventures? I mean, Amalie said quickly into the silence before he could take offense. You're very old. What if one day you just stop breathing and fall down dead right there in the middle of the road? What will you do without a family to mourn you or perform the proper rites? Rather than look offended, Martin just chuckled. I'm not worried, he said kindly, for I'm still many years away from death. But you can't know that. Amalie was suddenly very concerned for this strange old man, because he'd not laughed at her dreams or called her stupid for having them. He even seemed to share them. Grandfather Bai was very chipper and healthy and looked like he could live forever, and then one day he just died. Just like that, in the middle of dinner. What if that happens to you? Ah, Martin said, sounding a bit like a sage. Nothing like that will happen to me. I have the words of an ancient oracle who foretold the time of my death as assurance. As that time is still several years from now, I am not worried. She scowled, her eyebrows knitting together over her nose and clenched her jaw. Oracles, omens, magic, it's all the same, she said with a real rancor in her voice. It's fake. All made up by adults to fool little kids. You can't fool me. I don't believe in any of it. Oh, it's fortunate then, Martin said, his kindly tone not wavering in the slightest. Bet your belief is irrelevant. Amalie looked up from the fire and her eyes widened, although her jaw remained clenched. Magic exists regardless, Martin continued, of whether or not a single child believes in it. Magic, like truth, like the sun and moons and all the stars, exists because they exist. Not, he finished, because you believe in it. Disbelief warred with suspicion across her face and was overcome with distrust, her expression as easy to read as the faces of the moons. You're just like them, she said after a moment, lying about all that stupid stuff. I wish just once a grown-up would tell me the truth, instead of using magic as some easy answer to everything. Magic, he said, and this time his tone was no longer light and friendly, is not an easy answer. He looked over at the swelling ocean waves and listened for a moment to the soft susurrus as they beat against the shore. "It's true," he said to the sea, "that magic can do wondrous things. It can foretell the future and steal carefully hidden secrets from the past. It can heal wounds, even those that place you on the edge of death. The right magic spells can extend life or restore one's youth. Other magic can command the elements or help shape cities." Amalie had only heard of magic being able to do one or two of these things. "But magic also," Martin continued, his voice fading away so that she had to struggle to hear him over the sound of the waves and the wind, "can also do terrible things. It can peel the skin from your bones, take lives with a flick of its finger, burn cities and lay waste to civilizations. It can spread fear and poison, death and hatred as easily as it could do the opposite." He was silent for a moment, and although his gaze remained fixed, it did not reflect the waters before it. Amalie had heard about magic every day of her life, but never like the magic he'd described. The magic she knew was about predicting the rain and warding off ghosts and curses. It helped heal old grandmother Anafi, but left her weak and frail for the rest of her life. It never hurt anyone, and it certainly didn't kill people. "Would you like to hear a story?" Martin offered after a long silence, "about magic and the things it can do?" She opened her mouth to shape the word no, but stopped before her lips and tongue could breathe the word to life. She might know all the stories of magic told in her village, but she didn't know this story. "I guess so," she said, playing with the front of his jacket. "Very good," he said with a soft chuckle. Her play of disinterest didn't fool him. "This is the story of a little girl, a soldier wearied of war, a witch who wasn't, and a magic hat." "My mother's a witch," Amalie said before he could continue. His tone had sent shivers down her spine, or perhaps that had been the wind. "Oh?" he asked, not sounding bothered by her interruption. "What kind of witch?" "She's a weather witch and reads the weather omens." He didn't respond, so she added more. "She also has the knowing of ways, so she can steal secrets from stone and clay." Martin smiled. He had no idea what the knowing of the ways was, but that didn't matter. "That's a very important type of witch, to be sure. But it's not the type of witch you'll find in my story." Amalie crossed her arms and pulled the leather jacket closer around her. "I swear on my life that this story is true, although it will not always seem that way. You must make sure to listen well and judge nothing before the story is over." "I promise," she said with a nod, because this sounded a lot like the ritual opening to many stories the elders told in the village. "Very well, let's see how to begin." Once upon a time, there was a little girl who had a large family, all of whom loved her very much. We shall call her Josie, which is short for something or other. I forgot. She was born late in the fall, and fearing that winter's chill would steal her child away, Josie's mother gave her a special extra gift each year on her birthday. Many years it was a warm coat, large enough for her to grow into over the years. Other years it was a scarf or a pair of mittens. The year our story starts, the special gift was a knit hat. This very hat, in fact. It was Josie's favorite gift out of all of them, and even after spring had warmed up the world a little, she wore it everywhere she went. Now, Josie had a boundless curiosity for the world around her, and would often wander off when something took her fancy. Her family imposed several rules to try to keep her in bounds and to keep her safe. She was never to let go of their hands when she was in public, and she was never to stray from the path when she went walking outside. But she was getting older, and she often forgot to obey the rules when no one was watching her. So it was no surprise when one day after school, as she walked through the small copse of trees near her house, she left the dirt path and went into the brush. It was not a forest by any means, and was little more than some young trees bound in a few acres around a tall old weeping willow. But one should always remember that danger lurks in familiar places as often as it does in faraway forbidden lands. What had caught Josie's eyes was sculpture someone had shaped from nature. This artist had taken the low branches of the weeping willow and woven them with dead reeds and blooming thistle to create an arched doorway. Captivated, Josie played around the doorway, telling herself stories about fairy queens and heroic knights. In the midst of one such story, she danced beneath the archway and into the dim depths of the center of the weeping willow. Or so she thought, at any rate, for when she passed beneath the thorn-studded doorway, she found herself somewhere else entirely. It was a place she had never seen before, of that she was quite certain. All around her was an open field with no trace of willows or thistles, and certainly no doorways. At first she took it in with wonder, for it was such a pretty meadow, but then she looked up. Fear seized her heart and squeezed. Martin paused and looked over the 3 moons where they hung close to the horizon. Dawn, it seemed, was fast approaching. This place has 1 sun and 3 moons. The world that Josie came from had only 1 sun and 1 moon. The sky above her now, however, had 2 suns, glaring down at her like baleful eyes. This was not, as she had first thought, some other part of town, nor was it a clever trick someone was playing on her. This was not another land or nation. This was an entirely different world. Before she could get her bearing, she saw something. Walking toward her across the meadow was a group of soldiers, still covered in the grime of battle, looking alert and ready for anything. Fortunately for the little girl, the soldiers were all more than ready to leave battle behind them. They were wary of taking lives and just wanted to rest for a time. They had grown up in a world of war, and every man and many women that they knew had been pressed into the army. Those who had been left behind had starved as the war destroyed their farmlands and villages. It was a grim and dangerous world, but that didn't mean it had no good men. When the soldiers saw Josie looking fresh as a daisy in this place of death, they swore one and all to see her safely home, wherever that might be. But as she told them her story about a strange world with things like science and technology, which they had never heard of, and only 1 sun in the sky, they less and less sure they could help her. They had small magics in their world, and even those they knew little about. They had no power to help her. Most of the soldiers were veterans and have moved from battle to battle and war to war for many years now. But one among them was still a youth, barely more than a boy himself. And he remembered stories his mother had told him about a powerful witch from another world who lived in the forest by his village. While the village had long been razed by some passing army, the forest still stood. No had dared explore its depths, and fire had done little to the towering trees. Perhaps the young soldier offered, if the witch was real and still lived in the forest, she would have a way to send the little girl home. The other soldiers agreed, as it was the best idea they had, and so the young soldier and the little girl set off. Just like that? Amalie cut in. That's desertion. Martin tilted his head slightly to the side and blinked a few times. Of all the interjections he had expected her to make, and he'd planned for at least 3, this had not even been considered. While it could technically be called desertion, there were a few minor technicalities in martial law the soldier could agree if he was ever brought to trial. You see, the senior soldier of the group was his acting superior, as all the officers had died in the last few battles. While the soldier had no authority to hand out travel passes, he could give lawful orders, including the order for the soldier to escort the little girl home. And when the squad met up with the main army, all they had to do was report those orders to make them lawful and binding. But truthfully, I think they told another story instead. They probably told an easy lie, like the young soldier had died in battle, rather than explain the whole confusing mess. And I'm a little surprised that point mattered to you. My uncle was killed for deserting, Amalie said with the shamelessness of children. I'm sorry for your uncle. Why? She asked. He was a coward. Men leave war for many reasons, Martin said quietly, and not all of them are fear. He stared into the fire, and the flickering flames drew out the shadows on his face, and for a brief moment his shoulders sagged as his age rested on his shoulders like a heavy weight. Then he shook his head and straightened his back. In the soft smile he gave Amalie saw a sadness she had no word for. But none of that is what this story is about, he said. So let's put it aside. Now, where were we? So, the soldier and Josie set off in search of the witch. As their only guide, they had an old bedtime story, the nonsense poem found inside it, and the memories of a young man taken from his home too soon. For the most part, their journey was uneventful. They stayed away from the roads, villages, and patrols. The fastest route, the soldier thought, and the one least likely to cause them any problems, was the one that cut directly through the countryside. The roadways were too roundabout, and taking them would only waste time. They walked a lot over uneven earth, mostly covered in ash and new spring growth. They slept on the hard ground with the bugs and beetles, and they ate whatever they could scavenge. The best part was when the little girl told stories to the soldier. He told her the story that was guiding them, and she returned the favor by telling him stories about her world. She told him about something called science and something else called technology, and all the wonders they could perform in her world. Science is very similar to magic, you'll find, except it has a more consistent set of rules. Technology is built on science and can achieve things even magic finds impossible. The soldier asked many questions about science and technology, but he only half understood the answers. The little girl also told the soldier bedtime stories for her world. They were full of the whimsy and magic he knew, but they weren't real in the way the story they followed was real. Josie told him again and again. Only science was real. Again, the soldier did not understand, for what was the point of a story if it wasn't real? Such conversations filled their days, and time passed quickly. 2 weeks after they met, they reached the edge of the forest. The soldier's bedtime stories had included a nonsense poem about how to find the witch. I don't remember it anymore, but it had lines about always walking on the left side of oak trees and turning around 3 times before crossing any stream. Following these directions, no matter how silly they seemed, the two of them traveled deep into the trees until they find the witch. Or so they believed at first. What they found was a cabin. It followed no obvious design and sprawled across several small clearings. Trees and brushes grew right up against the wall, and in one notable area, a tree actually grew out of the roof. There was a long, wide porch on the front with vines and flowers offering shade as they twined around the banister spread every few feet. On this porch was an older woman, perhaps 40 years old, who looked kind and gentle. She greeted them both warmly when they stepped from between the trees. But she was not, they soon learned, the witch from another world they had come seeking. "I'm just a wise woman," she said, "and have only a little of my own magic." She was called Taimana, and she was the granddaughter of the witch. Still, she had the witch's magic tomes and the knowledge of 5 generations of witches and wise women. She could do what she could to help them. For this part, you really have to understand the basic concepts of magic, the core principles beneath all the inconsistencies which apply in every world, regardless of the specific spells you can cast. But that would take too long, so I'll try to sum it up a bit. Basically, all magic has a price. The most common price is a little bit of the power that all people carry inside them. It might vary in size, shape, and strength, but every single person has a power within them, and if the power matches the magic, it activates. Without that power as the price of passage to the other world, one could walk through a magic doorway 100 times and go nowhere at all. Josie, it turned out, had once a great power within her. It was fed every time she thought about fairies and faraway places, and it had allowed her to pass through that door of thistle and willow to reach this world. But she had not known then how dangerous faraway places could be, and how hard it was to return home to her mother's arms. The power within her had flickered and died, and now she had nothing left. But fortune loved this girl almost as much as her family did, and smiled upon her yet again. The stories she told the soldiers had kindled with him the same power she had once borne, and now it burned bright and fierce inside him. He wanted to see the other worlds, to see science and technology firsthand. He wanted to meet fairies and learn magic and perhaps a trade and leave a war far behind. This was power enough, Taimana assured them, to let him pass through any doorway he found. The power had a flaw, though, and that was that it would not always take him where he wanted to go. There was no way to guarantee they would ever find the same world Josie had come from, whether he passed through one doorway or 1,000. But while they had found a wise woman instead of a witch, their journey had not been in vain. Taimana had a little bit of magic of her own, and she used it now. She took her small magic power and the great power from within the soldier. Then from the little girl, she took memories of home and the desperate need to be held in her mother's loving arms once more. She took these things and she tied them up together. Magic like this required a physical component, and so Taimana wove the separate forces into Josie's head and knotted them up tight. As she worked, Taimana sang another little nonsense poem, like the one that led the way to her cabin. Fate glows red, she said, and the home fire burns yellow. Blue bears truth, and violet births whimsy and wonder. Green is a lonely watch, while pink bustles with many breaths. White should be taken only in dire need, and black is certain death. On the last word she finished. Now, the head had held a surprisingly well, but it was still wool, and it was very dirty. But as soon as the magic touched it, the dust from the road fell away, leaving the head neat as a dewdrop. Taimana prepared 2 packs, with food, clothes, and camping gear. Then she waved farewell to Josie and the soldier as they set off into the forest, searching for a doorway to another world. The first doorway they found was actually a ring of mushrooms. When they reached the center, the scenery around them changed. Suddenly they were in a dense and hot jungle, and the second sun was gone from the sky. For the next few days they fled strange animals and fought against wicked plants. The second doorway was found among the vines, which nature had shaped into a rough rectangular shape between 2 trees. Eager to get away from the plants, they fled through the door without checking it first. On the other side was an empty world, without any human life whatsoever. The little pixie sprites more than made up for it, however, and kept the travelers company as they searched for the next doorway. This door was much closer, only a few hours' walk away, and was built out of stone. After they went through it and stepped into the new world, Josie performed the same ritual she always did. She pulled a small magic piece of technology out of her pocket and tried to use it. It was a strange device that flipped open and had like little buttons she could press. She'd explained that it let her communicate with people a long way away. On most worlds it did nothing at all, but this time it worked. They had reached Josie's homeworld at last, but they were not anywhere near her home. Rather, they were on the far side of the planet in a nation that spoke an entirely different language. Now, worlds like this, a lot of rules for identification and proper behavior. And a strange man walking around with a young girl he is not related to while carrying weapons is not something anyone looked kindly on. So while the exact difficulties they faced are not important, you have to understand that finding the right world was easy. Getting Josie from the wrong part of that world to the right part was much harder and took them several more days. Eventually they reached the right place. Josie ran to her mother, who swooped her up and hugged her tight. Her whole family gathered around, and they listened as she babbled out her story in fits and bursts. The young soldier watched it all, and he felt happy, I suppose, and proud at what he had done. It was nothing like what he felt after winning a battle, and he liked the feeling. Josie's family may not have believed everything she told them, but they believed that the soldier had saved her and kept her safe. They welcomed him into their home and offered him a place there. They would teach him all about their world, they promised, about science and technology and all the rest. He could stay with them as long as he liked. His family was dead and his village burned, and so he was very tempted by their offer. But he had seen only 3 other worlds. What other amazing sights were out there? Could he learn more of magic? What would he find on the next world or the next after that? He had to know. So the soldier took the hat and left in search of the first magic doorway Josie had used, although he hoped it didn't take him to the same place it had taken her. When Martin finished his story, he fell silent. Amalie slid her arms into his coat sleeves, although it was far too large for her, and had crossed her arms over her chest as she listened. She had no idea what to say, and still wasn't sure she believed any of it. Martin glanced over once more and saw the grey light that often preceded the dawn creeping over the horizon. With a deep sigh, he pulled the head back out of the bag, the round tassel hanging limp over the edge. "Here," Martin said as he held it out across the fire. "See the magic for yourself." She hesitated, but then reached out and took the hat. It was even softer than she'd imagined, and felt more like a cloud than the rough wool hats she was used to. Gingerly, she put it on. It was so warm enough, but she felt nothing special as it hugged her head. "Now look there," Martin said, and he pointed toward a part of the ocean above the sunken city. Amalie followed the line of his finger, and when her gaze fell upon the waves, she gasped. The ocean was glowing. There was a definite glowing ball beneath the waves, although it was a bit lumpy, as if several circles overlapped. Above the cresting swell of the waves, floating freely in the air like fireflies, sharp lines of color swayed and danced. But when the first light of dawn gleamed on the horizon, the lines of color and glowing spot vanished. "They're gone!" Amalie yelled, clutching the head firmly to her, as if to make sure it was still there. "The magic's gone!" "Yes," Martin said calmly. "From what I understand, the city is exposed by the tides only once every 8 years or so." He sighed. "I'm glad the portals close when it's beneath the waters. But, Amalie said, her distress growing as she reached an inescapable conclusion of all she'd heard. "That means you can't leave. You lost your chance to go to the other world." Martin chuckled and waved his hand vaguely in the air. "There's always another doorway somewhere else. I'll find it eventually." Oh, she hadn't thought of that. Amalie took off the hat, gazing down at it with awe, and handed it back with slightly more reluctance than she'd taken it. Martin took the hat, but it put it back in his silk bag and then slid the bag into an inner pocket of his fur coat. "So the hat's like both a map and a key at once?" "It certainly guides the way," he said, "but it's more like a compass than a map. As for the key, that's inside me." He pressed a hand to his chest, and then he looked over at Amalie's across the fire. "And maybe it's inside you as well." "Me?" Amalie asked, looking down and copying his gesture. "Yeah," he explained. "I think that inside you is the same yearning for adventure and other worlds that I have. Of course, you're still very young and wholly unprepared for such a life. If you go on an adventure right now, I fear you'd lose your life. Or lose the spark that drives you." He shook his head, looking sad. "You're not ready." "I'm ready," Amalie exclaimed. "I can go on an adventure right now." "Oh?" Martin raised an eyebrow, although this was lost beneath his wrinkles. "Do you have food with you then? What about weapons or tools? Did you leave your camping gear somewhere nearby?" Amalie looked down and then to the side. She fiddled with the edges of his coat and scrunched it on herself. Did you say goodbye to your family and mean it?" he said, knowing that you might never see them again. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she held them back. "There's nothing wrong with being eager," he continued in a softer tone. "But if you're not prepared, you will die." He let her sit in silence for a short time, and then he clapped his hands together without much sound. "Now, it's not often I meet a fellow adventurer, so I will make you a special offer." "What?" she sniffed without looking up. "I will stay here for a time and teach you what you need to know to go on a proper adventure." Amalie looked up, her face breaking into a grin. "I won't stay forever, of course, but I can certainly stay long enough to see you properly started on the right path." "Really? You mean it? You'll teach me?" Amalie asked, her eyes glowing brighter than the rising sun. "But in return, you must promise me something." "Anything." "First lesson," Martin said as he wagged a finger at her. "Never make a promise until you know the terms." "Right. Sorry." She nodded to show she understood. What do you want me to promise you?" Martin leaned forward slightly and smiled. "You must promise me that you will not go on any more adventures until you are 20 years old." 20? Amalie shouted. "But that's super old." Martin chuckled and shook his head. Amalie, 20 is still a child. I've lived nearly 5 times that long, and I assure you, by that time you'll just barely be ready for adventures on this world, let alone other worlds. 5 times? 20, then 5, and Amalie mumbled to herself as she wriggled her fingers. 100? She shouted a few seconds later. You're 100 years old? Almost, Martin said. I'm still a few years shy. But how? He shrugged. Magic again, I expect. And the ever-beckoning doorways. Now, he said with another quiet clap. You get to tell me your story. Amalie opened her mouth, looked away and closed it. She opened it again, but once more closed it without saying anything. Or I could guess it. Martin spared her the need to admit her wrongs. You wanted to go on adventures, but the people around you told you that you were too young, that it was too dangerous and that you should stay home. She nodded slightly. You heard about the city being revealed by the tides and knew you had to take this chance right away. Again, she gave a single nod. You probably lied to someone or several someones and snuck out all on your own. A third nod. You wanted to prove them wrong, I expect, and never thought hard enough about what you were doing to realize that you were in the wrong instead. A final nod and a sniffle. Amalie, I think you owe your family many apologies. Yes, she agreed through her tears. She'd only just taken him as a teacher, and his first lecture had made her feel smaller than any of her mother's long rants. Let's get you home then, so you can offer one, he said and stood up. She followed, and for a moment they both stood around, brushing sand off of their clothes. He clipped his sword back on and kicked sand over what was left of the fire. Then Amalie led the way down the beach and toward her village. They walked in silence for a short time before Amalie asked a question. Although both of them had been up all night and were no doubt very tired, Martin answered it, and all the questions that followed. Josephine, he mumbled suddenly about part way there. What? Amalie asked. Nothing. Soon enough they reached the village where Amalie lived and found her frantic mother searching through the streets. Amalie had snuck out of her house after the family had gone to bed, and so they had not noticed her missing at first. But they woke with the dawn several hours ago and had noticed her missing immediately. They had been searching for her ever since and were so overjoyed to see her return to them safe and whole that it took them a few minutes to notice Martin at all. Unlike Amalie's question, which he felt he had to answer properly as her teacher, he gave only vague answers when her family began to question him. He was used to giving unclear but satisfactory answers to questions about where he came from and what he did, and so he thought nothing of telling her family the same easy lies. He mentioned nothing of heads or portals or adventures or other worlds. A few days after setting Amalie's family at ease with his friendly manner and well-rehearsed answers, Martin slid quietly into the daily life of the village. He spent the next few years teaching Amalie those skills he insisted were necessary for anyone who wanted to go on real adventures. The first set of skills were expected and included hunting, fishing, camping, trekking, and basic combat with several types of weapons. But Martin's lessons went beyond these areas as well. He made sure Amalie learned how to sew, knit, and weave from her mother and elder sisters, and then he took her to learn more about dyeing and textiles from nearby artisans. They visited other craftsmen as well, from the cobbler to the blacksmith and from the tanner to the stonemason. In addition to these practical skills, Martin would often lecture her for hours on bits of random information. He spent days explaining the core fundamentals of magic and then several weeks describing all the ways magic varied from world to world. He tried to explain science and technology as well, but always stopped to explain that he didn't know much about them himself. Her favorite thing that he taught her was the knowing of ways, which Martin called reading and writing. He explained that stone and clay were not the only tools one could use, and then he told her all about ink and brushes, pen and pencils and paper, papyrus and parchment. Amalie fell in love with the way the whole thing worked and dreamed of days when she would visit worlds that had the thing Martin called books. Then one day, about 3 years after he'd first met her, Martin packed a light rucksack with food for 2 or 3 days and left the village. Amalie, he told her the night before, I'm leaving tomorrow. But why? I still have so much to learn from you. Let this be my last lesson to you, he said, resting one of his gnarled old hands on her shoulder. If you're going to follow my steps and travel from one world to another in search of adventure, there will always be times when you must leave friends behind. When that happens, I want you to keep this in mind. Cherish whatever the universe gives you, be it a place or a person you have met, or even a small trinket you have picked up along your way. And when the universe takes it away, do not cling to it, but let it go like water carries away the leaves of fall. She'd gotten used to this cryptic comments, and so she nodded.
I'll miss you, she said through tears, and then she hugged the old man tightly. I'll miss you too, he said, patting her head. And if fate wills it, we will meet again. Then he took only those things which he had brought with him and the bag of food, and he walked away. Amalie threw herself further into her studies and even begged her mother to teach her how to read the weather omens, which she had once thought were nothing more than old superstition.
Another 5 years passed in a blink, and one day she opened her eyes and she was 20 years old. And now we're getting to the gift. As she sat up in bed, she noticed a small package on her night table. Reaching over, she picked it up. It was a scrap of rough canvas cloth, tied around a soft object with tweed string. Eagerly, she tore it open and smiled at what she found. Hold on, let's see. Do we have some fabric inside? It's a hat. It's a hat. Oh, and it says books are like, oh wow, oh my gosh, I love it. First off, it's yellow. I love yellow, especially this like mustard yellow. And it says books are life. It's so awesome. I love it because it has this super soft stuff inside. What do you think? Can I wear this? Yeah, can I? Let's go. There we go. Okay, I'm loving it, and it just has snowed outside today for the first time in like forever, and it feels perfect to have a hat. I mean, I do have a couple of hats, but I like that. I like that it's soft inside, and yeah. There's something written, and I'm assuming this letter is printed in here. Let's finish the story. We have one more page to go. It was the hat, the magic hat from Martin's story, which she had not seen again since that night. Folded up inside were 3 pieces of Martin's precious paper, covered over in a neat hand she recognized right away, although the letter wasn't signed. Amalie, the first page read. Today is a joyous day. If you are still determined to go on adventures and haven't chosen yet to settle down to a happy life in your village, then today you take the first steps on your journey. I'm sorry that I could not be there to take them with you, but I'm leaving this gift in your mother's keeping until the time of your promise. You will worry about me, I'm sure. What will I do out here on my own with no special magic to guide my way? Worry not, I tell you, because the truth is I haven't needed the magic of the hat for many years now. Just as someone who spends their whole life looking at a compass while one day start to feel true north in their bones. I have learned how to see the lights and lines without the hat. It certainly made them clearer, and when there was some confusion, I'd wear the hat to sort it out. But such things happen rarely, and I feel no concern in passing this magic to you. On the next few pages, you will find the explanation on how to use the hat to find doorways and activate them. It's more of a legend, really, like on a map, than a set of directions, but I hope it will prove useful to you. I am waiting for you out here among the other worlds, and I look forward to seeing the grand woman you have become. Best of luck to you and safe travels. Several worlds away, an old man sat by a dying fire. Alone by a river, he was watching the natural stone bridge that spanned the water. He did not need to count the suns, nor the moons, nor even the stars in the sky. He would not be staying long. As he stepped across the bridge, he wondered happily what he'd find on the other side. And that is it for today. Let me know what you think of the story below. Let me know what you think of the gift of the hat. I think I'm loving it. Sorry, I'm not looking in the camera. I'm looking into the viewfinder to see, into the little screen to see the wonderful hat on me, and I'm loving it. I'm loving it. I think this is a hat that I can pull off. So yeah, let me know what you think. Did you like the story? It's not as long as today's. Today's was quite long, but there's quite a lot of mistakes in here, like little spelling mistakes and stuff that make it a little bit hard for me to read. But I hope that you can follow along and that my reading is not too bad. And I hope that you join me again for day 3 next week. So yeah, please hit that subscribe button before you leave and like this video to support me. Write down in the comments what you think of this, and I hope to see you again on my channel really soon. Until then, bye!
Just loving this moment. Can we stay here forever? I'm loving this moment. Can we stay here together? If I could stop the time, don't you know that I would? 'Cause I'm just loving